right, I think we're ready to get started. I'm Kim Gorham. I'm a volunteer here at the Texas Sports Hall of Fame. Thanks for coming to this episode of our second annual Sports Book Festival. I'm here to introduce T.G. Webb with the publication of Battle of the Brazos, subtitled A Texas Football Rivalry, a Riot, and a Murder. Waco's T.G. Webb adds author to a resume that includes stints as a sports writer, salesman, recruiter, stockbroker, and pastor. Born in Tyler, the fourth-generation Texan, graduated from Baylor in 1997 with a double major in political science and religion, then earned an MBA from Tarleton State in 2008. He's an avid college football fan and a reader of history, and he drew on those passions to research and write the most complete accounting to date of the infamous 1926 riot that left a Texas A&M cadet dead, including indications of a cover-up that shielded the identity of the student's killer for almost a century. Tim lives and works in Waco, and he is now at work on his second book, and he's going to read from it and talk about it, and when he's done, there'll be plenty of time to ask questions. Please welcome Tim Webb.
All right. Well, thank you. This is a good-sized group here. I'm honored with some special friends that have come to support me from work, but there's also some good strangers in this room as well. So a couple of just quick special thanks. First of all, for Jay Black for the invitation to come here. My book has only been on the market since July 30th, and so we're only 11 days into this, and this is my debut book. So what a way to get to debut it publicly. And anybody that purchases a copy today, you probably have what would be considered an advanced copy because Amazon will not start shipping until September. So you get a chance to kind of get to read it and get to know the story before everybody else does. Also want to thank Chad Conine. He was in the room. There he is. He's come back in the room. Chad actually introduced me through a friend at work. Or I was introduced to Chad by a friend at work last year, and so Chad met me for lunch over at Shorty's Pizza, and we talked about just the publishing process because it's a little bit intimidating to say, how do you get a manuscript out in front of a potential publisher? And so Chad was gracious with his time. He's also been a great promoter of this event on television, radio, in the newspaper, and been very, very selfless in promoting not just his own work, but promoting all the other authors. So I think we all owe you kind of a debt of gratitude today, Chad. And one final one, I wanted to say this is a very special day in the Webb household. It is my mother's birthday, and she's hiding in the back of the room. I am the baby in the family, so you can imagine what she is probably thinking today to have one of her children up here talking about a book that's been published by Texas A&M Press, and a special thanks to Texas A&M as well for seeing the value in this story and for wanting it to be told just as much as I did. I think they did a beautiful job on it. There's a aha moment for your first book when you pull it out of the box and you see what they did with it as far as the graphics and the design, and I was extremely satisfied with it. If you haven't seen it, there are copies of it out front in the bookstore. You would have to purchase it through the Hall of Fame. I'm going to have a table set up in the back. Feel free to come back and meet me when the presentation's over. I would love to talk to you about the story. And so, for those of you that are fans of collegiate sports in this part of the country, the title, Battle of the Brazos, it probably is no surprise to you. That refers to the ancient history between Texas A&M University, originally the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas, which is what it was called technically at the time that I write about, and Baylor University right here just across the street from us, and actually I guess across the river from us as well. We're almost encircled here by Baylor University nowadays. And the subtitle hints at that there are really three stories in the book. I talk about not just the rivalry, but also about the riot that was alluded to just a moment ago, and then also what has been called a murder. And so I just want to spend a few minutes highlighting each of those three strands for you, and then I'll gladly take some questions from you. So this is a new book, but it tells a very old story. The rivalry between Baylor and Texas A&M dates back to 1899, and as of 2011, it is temporarily on hold. When A&M departed for the Southeastern Conference, the scheduling was broken between those two schools, as well as a couple of other old rivalries here in Texas that maybe someday we'll all be fortunate enough to have renewed. But that rivalry saw many, many games throughout its history, very much a one-sided rivalry in most people's recollection today. Since 1986, the games that have been played really have been in A&M's favor. During that span from '86 to 2011, A&M only lost twice to Baylor, in 2004 and in 2008, and then there was a tie in 1990. It was at that 2008 game where I first learned about the story that I actually had the honor of writing about. I was a graduate from Baylor University. I attended here in the mid-1990s, all 4 years, and oddly enough, had never heard of this story. I was speaking with a gentleman that introduced me just a moment ago, and he said, he's always kind of heard a little bit about the story. I allude to in my introduction that for decades, echoes of the riot and whispers of a murder haunted the rivalry between Texas A&M and Baylor, in the sense that people knew that something bad had happened one time in the rivalry, but no one had ever actually taken the time really to delve into it and to look into it. And I think if you read the book, at the end of the book, you'll get a good sense of maybe why both schools didn't want to take a closer look at what had actually happened on that terrible day. For most of the rivalry, though, between Texas A&M and Baylor, I found out in my research it was one of the best rivalries in the Southwest Conference. In fact, from 1931, when the two schools decided to start playing each other once again after they had gotten over what had happened in 1926, all the way through the year 1985, a period of 55 years, A&M only had a 2-game lead in the series. They had a 25, 23, and 5 record, and yet modern fans don't remember that. Now, Arkansas and SMU in the Southwest Conference actually had a split record during that period, an equal number of wins and losses. But Baylor and A&M had the most competitive rivalry because of all of the pairings that you could choose in the old Southwest Conference. More games were decided by less than a touchdown in the A&M and Baylor rivalry from 1931 to 1985 than anybody else. In fact, 24 games were decided by a touchdown or less, and 5 ended in a tie. That's more than half of the games played over the course of half of a century. So you start to see why it was a very competitive rivalry. The two teams looked forward to each other. In fact, some of the largest crowds in the Southwest Conference history era were drawn to the Baylor-Texas A&M game. The biggest draw, obviously, was the Thanksgiving matchup between UT and A&M. And other than that, the largest crowds usually were the Baylor A&M game. Whenever Baylor went to Texas A&M, the only crowd that would be larger was when the Longhorns came to town. And when A&M came to Waco, they often set multiple attendance records at the old Baylor Stadium and later Floyd Casey Stadium. And so there was a lot of passion around this game. But as I got into the research, I found out that the golden era of the rivalry was not 1931 through 1985, but it was a short decade, a 10-year period, 11 games from 1916 to 1926, when for just a brief moment the rivalry actually was as popular, if not maybe slightly popular, than the UT A&M rivalry. It was a game that people looked forward to so much that for one event, you had fans coming all the way from California and New York just to attend a game here in Central Texas. And when you think about in the 1920s, there were no interstate systems. Cars didn't drive quite as fast as they do now. They didn't get near the gas mileage that they do. There weren't a lot of plane rides that you would take cross country back in those days. So most of those people rode on a multiple day train ride just to come and see a football game here in Waco, Texas. And that's one of the little tidbits that you'll learn when you read the book, is that for those 11 years, 1916 and 1926, the game was exclusively held in Waco every single year. There was none of this home and home series. In fact, Baylor did not play at Kyle Field in College Station for the first time until 1931. If you go back to the record books, you'll see that there are some games that are said to be at Texas A&M earlier in the rivalry, but all those were played at a fair in Navarro County. So the first time that Baylor actually set foot at Kyle Field was 1931, when the two schools reunited and decided that they were going to get over what they had gone through in 1926. And so it was the passion of that rivalry that led to the rivalry's worst day, and that was October 30th, 1926. 92 years ago, and barely a mile from where we all stand here, at a long-forgotten place called the Texas Cotton Palace. Anybody here familiar with the old Texas Cotton Palace? Yeah, so for 21 years, the Cotton Palace was an annual exposition. It was a fall fair, just like the Texas State Fair. It would last for 2 weeks, and in fact, it was a rival to the Texas State Fair. Over 21 years, over 8 million patrons came to Waco, Texas to visit. The busiest day was during World War I, when Camp MacArthur was open on the west side of town, the northwest side of town, and over 117,000 people attended the Cotton Palace on that one day. You're talking about a time when the city of Waco had 35,000 to 40,000 people. So it was a very big event. And then all of a sudden, Baylor and Texas A&M decided to host their annual game there. And it went from being just a local affair between two old rivals to being a full-blown rivalry that garnered statewide attention, and as I indicated, even some national attention, where you would have alumni of the schools and fans of the teams travel from each coast to come and watch the game. And so it was no surprise that passions were set to maybe overrun at some point, and they did with tragic consequences on October 30th, 1926. It was at that game that perhaps the worst rivalry, and if not, the worst riot, and if not the worst, certainly one of the worst in American collegiate athletic history, erupted on the center of the field. So we all have seen riots. Usually today it's pro teams when they win national championships, or maybe college teams. You kind of expect to see thousands of people pouring into the streets doing bad things. We've all seen burning cars, burning sofas. It's somewhat of a little bit of a familiar sight. I was going to take a stab there in my original thoughts about a Big 12 rival, but I won't. So I'll just let it linger to say, which school was I thinking of there when I was talking about burning sofas? I think we've got a couple of contenders here on the front row that they're thinking of. But we're also, it's an unfortunate part of sports history that there are sometimes bench clearing brawls. It's a dreaded moment when you see 50, 60 people, sometimes 100 people when the bench is clear, rushing out and just swinging fists in a free-for-all. What we're not used to seeing in the modern age is a bleacher clearing brawl. And that's where the fans pour out of the bleachers onto the field and actually engage in a hand-to-hand combat, or in this case, worse. And that's exactly what happened. Estimates, if you read all of the sources and all of the history about it, it's no doubt that there were hundreds of students from both schools, and then some supporters as well, that rushed onto the field and started swinging fists wildly. Unfortunately, some from Baylor University picked up the wooden chairs that they were sitting on and broke them into weapons and took them onto the field as well. And that's why we had such a tragic outcome. If you look at the highest estimate, it could possibly be as many as 1,000 students were engaged in the riot at one time on the field. And so that leads to the third story of the book, and that is the story about Charles Milo Sessoms. He was a 24-year-old cadet at A&M. He was a senior, looking forward to graduating along with a brother who was also a senior at Texas A&M at the time. They were set to graduate in the spring of 1927. And of course, tragic things happened that day, and he would pass away the next morning from an injury that he had sustained during the brawl when he was struck in the head with what was best described as one of the pieces of one of those wooden chairs. And so that's when the cloud started to settle over the rivalry. Within days, the administrations decided that the two schools maybe needed a time to cool off. They couldn't find a better way forward. In the book, I refer to that as it was hard for wisdom to find its way. And that was a quote directly from the president of Baylor University at the time in a private letter that he had written to a supporter who was hoping that the rivalry would continue. Unfortunately, Samuel Palmer Brooks said he didn't see a good way that it would survive because it was hard for wisdom to find its way. And so eventually the two schools decided to part company for a period of 5 years, and that's when they renewed their rivalry in 1931. One of the most exciting things about getting to research this story, though, was I got to connect with members of the slain young man's family. I got to connect with two. Unfortunately, one that I wanted to speak to passed away about a half year before I was able to track them down. So in 2010 and 2011, Dallas Morning News journalist Kevin Sherrington wrote a couple of articles on this very, very same story here. And in that, his second article, he revealed that there had been a private investigation of the affairs in Waco conducted by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. So you think of the Pinkerton detectives, they've guarded presidents, they've guarded fine works of art, but they actually were here in Waco as well for a little over a month, investigating the cause of the riot and trying to track down the person or persons who had killed Charley Sessoms. Unfortunately, that investigation ended unsuccessfully, and the family for 9 decades kept the personal investigative notes from that detective in their personal family files. And until the release of Kevin Sherrington's article in 2011 and until the release of my book, those have never really been looked into, actually have never been looked into publicly before. And so they provide a lot of great source material for a couple of chapters later in the book where you'll get to learn a lot of facts that have never been told about this. We were speaking before the presentation about just some of the enduring myths and legends that have grown up around the story. And one of them is that the Aggies were so upset about what had happened in Waco that some of their cadets had seized their parade cannon, loaded it on a train, commandeered the train, and they were stopped en route to Waco, where their intention was to level the Baylor campus. It's kind of a humorous story when you look at it now, because it almost seems like a caricature of history. Fortunately, they were derailed from accomplishing their plans. There's multiple versions of the story. In some, it's the A&M administration. In other, it's the state police. Other, it's the Texas Rangers. In one version, it's the National Guard. Fortunately, though, they never made it to Waco. The truth is that story most likely is apocryphal, though there is an interesting picture in the 1927 Texas A&M yearbook, which is oddly enough named the Longhorn in those days, and it shows a cannon on a train. And so that is possibly the genesis for the myth that was later spun into this wild story that the Aggies were going to come and bombard the Baylor campus. The truth is there's no contemporary corroboration. And so as I was researching it, I had to deal with a lot of myths and legends. I also knew that there were a lot of people that thought they knew something that had happened in Waco, especially with our neighbors to the southeast. This story is a little bit more alive at A&M than it is at Baylor. It's very common to meet someone here in Waco that maybe doesn't know about the story. But there's a sense at A&M that something happened bad with Baylor at one time. What they can't tell you is when it happened or even what the young man's name is. And so one of the things that this book is going to correct, it's going to correct that history. It's going to fill in a few gaps and a few voids. And so I dedicated the book to the memory of Charley, and the dedication simply reads, "For Charley, now your name will always live." And there's some significance to that as readers of the book, if you do read it, you will get to see that there was a one-page tribute in the 1927 yearbook at A&M with a poem written that was called "At the 11th Hour." And in that poem, it has the line that says, "Aggie of ours in manhood's prime, time leaves little but names, but you and yours will always live in Aggie halls of fame." And so I borrowed a line from that and took poetic license with it, if you will, and took it to say, not only will your name live, but now it will always live, because it's been memorialized. The justice that he was never given back in 1926 and in the years that followed, I think in a small measure, has been delivered here. And that brings me to the last thing. Last night I received a message, a Facebook message from one of the family members I got to meet. So Charley had 3 brothers and a sister. He was the 4th in the family, and one of his older brothers, Joseph, had a child that he eventually named Charles William Sessoms, named after the slain cadet. Unfortunately, Charles William Sessoms, who went by the name Bill, never got to meet his uncle. He was born a few years after Charley's death. Bill was the relative that I tried to track down from the Kevin Sherrington article back in 2011. I didn't see the article until 2012. I was about 2-3 years into my research at that point. So by the time I tracked the family down in North Carolina, I reached Bill's widow, Bonnie Sessoms, and found out that Bill had died about 6 months earlier. And I regretted that, because this was an incident that left a negative impression on that family that exists somewhat still, I believe, to this day. He had a sister that preserved the family records, the notes and all, Sister Grace, and then she passed those on to one of her nieces, and that is the lady that I've been in touch with. And she wrote last night that she had just finished reading the book yesterday, and I was relieved. I actually felt that I had exhaled when I read that she approved of the book. And because that was something that, as I got in touch with them a few years ago, you start to be very conscious of, that you're going to be telling somebody else's story. And there are a couple of facts in there that I'm sure the family never knew, some literally play-by-play of the riot and of the fight that happened, and specifically around their relative that I don't think the family has ever necessarily been able to read. And so to hear her approval of the book last night and her support for it just meant all the world. But I think that also will tell you, whether you're a Baylor Bear or whether you're a Texas A&M Aggie, I think you'll enjoy this book. It was presented in a way that I believe is unbiased and fair and hopefully very engaging and informative. If you're a fan of Texas history, I think you'll like it too. There's a lot of history about the universities at the beginning of the book, and the real action kind of picks up around chapter 4 and carries through the end of it. I would love to talk to you a little bit more about it. I've got a website if you'd like to connect with me that way. It's tgweb.com. I've got a table set up in the very back. They are selling the books, as I said at the beginning, out here at the bookstore. We'd love for you to pick up a copy. If not, just stop by. I'd love to shake your hand and talk to you a little bit about the story.